Not all relationships continue on forever in that maintenance stage. Sometimes we decide to terminate a relationship. That is, we enter into de-escalation and then the relationship eventually dissolves. This usually happens when there's a recognition of dissatisfaction by one or more of the relational partners, and then they start engaging in disengagement. That is, they start rescinding themselves from the relationship itself, and they stop spending time with the other person, and they stop sharing interests with the other person. So this is relatively representative of disengagement. Whenever the relationship ends, there are a number of ways that this relationship can actually end. One is a manipulation strategy of termination, and this is where you actually intentionally present evidence of some sort of serious breach of faith. Then you leave it to the other party to take direct action about the situation. So you might claim the other person has betrayed you. The other person has been disloyal to you. The other person has hurt you deeply, and then it's in their court to actually take the direct action in the relationship. And then you have the withdrawal or avoidance strategy of termination. And this is very indirect though. And you don't really tell them exactly what you want. You're leaving it up to them to figure it out. Maybe you just stop texting them or calling them all together. And if you see them in person, you keep your conversation to really short words. You don't really spend a whole lot of time with them. And that's your way of trying to indicate indirectly that the relationship's over for you. Then you have a direct, honest, open sort of strategy to terminating the relationship. This is more respectful of the other person. It's sensitive to their emotions. It's where you communicate to them why you're disengaging and your desire to dissolve the relationship. And it helps them to better be able to move forward as well and make decisions that are appropriate as well. Now, when we look at relationships, there's something that is very unique that happens in relationships, and it's the dialectical tensions that we experience, the push and pulls of relationships. And relational dialectics is a field within interpersonal communication in which scholars study the opposite pulls or tensions that both people feel in any relationship. And there are several very common dialectical tensions that are experienced within relationships. And I'll just expose you to those right now. One is autonomy connection. That is the desire to feel very independent and to feel very much like you're in control. You have the right to make your own decisions about yourself without consideration of the other person, but at the same time you have a desire to be very connected to the other person, to be in relationship with them, maybe even to make joint decisions. And you might be thinking to yourself, how can you feel both of those at the same time? Well, we do. In many of relationships, a great example is probably the relationship between parents and their child as their child graduates from high school and goes off to college. Because in many senses, there's a strong desire for the child to exert their own independence and to be autonomous, to make decisions for themselves, and to be responsible. Yet at the same time, there's a great desire for connection within the relationship, and sometimes by necessity because the parents are still paying the bills. They're financially still responsible for the child. The child's still dependent upon the parents in many ways. But this represents that autonomy connection dialectic. Also, you have openness and closeness. That is the desire to reveal information, disclose information to the other person. But at the same time, you want to keep some things private until you feel like you can trust them. And there's that push and pull on the relationship, the desire to disclose and the desire to keep things to yourself. And you have to find a way to manage that. And then finally, there's novelty prediction. That is the desire to have newness to the relationship, for there to be spontaneity within the relationship, but at the same time, you want some level of predictability. You don't want it to be completely unpredictable. You want to be able to know that the other person's going to answer your call when you call them, or that they're going to be at a certain place at a certain time because that's predictable for you, or that when you ask them to drop everything because it's an emergency, that would be a predictable aspect to the relationship. So there's some things you want to be predictable. How do we manage these tensions though? Because they are ongoing in our interpersonal relationships, and sometimes they bring about change when we have to deal with them directly. Well, there's 4 primary ways that we deal with them. One is temporal selection. That is, you actually pick one side of the dialectic over the other for a given period of time. Usually not for an extended period of time, but for a given period of time. So for example, you might select connection over autonomy for a way to deal with the pressures that you're feeling and the tensions that you're feeling in the relationship for, just a segment of time. Topical segmentation is when we separate situation or spheres of life as a way to manage those dialectical tensions. And so you might say in the open and closedness dialectic, look, all right, I have a desire to be open with you. So certain issues, completely open. But at the same time, because I don't want to tell you everything about my life, there's some things that I want to remain in the secret category of the Johari window. Because of that, these sort of topics are going to be off limits. And that's a way to deal with it. Topical segmentation. Neutralization is compromising in order to partially satisfy needs in the dialectic. So this is where you say, okay, I'm a person who likes stability and prediction, but you love novelty. So I'm going to try to be a little bit more novel in this area, and you try to be a little bit more predictable in this area. That's the way you can compromise. Then there's reframing, and that is to put less emphasis on a dialectical contradiction and put emphasis elsewhere within the relationships. And so it's a changing of your perceptions, and so that you can see the relationship differently and those tensions differently. There are two interpersonal theories that really affect a large part relationships generally. One is interpersonal needs theory, and this is the theory that presupposes that we have basic needs that are met through our interpersonal relationships, and we continue relationships when we maintain relationships based on how these needs are being met. One is inclusion, that is the feeling of belonging. Another is affection, being loved and cared for. And then finally, control, that is the ability to have some sense of control over our lives and really even other people to a certain extent. And as those needs are met, we tend to maintain and continue relationships. Also, exchange theory offers up a way to conceptualize the ongoing relationships that we have and even possibly why we may dissolve a relationship. Cost-reward ratio is when we do basically a cost-benefit analysis of the relationship. What is this relationship costing me in terms of what do I have to sacrifice, what do I have to give up, versus what am I rewarded with through this relationship? What benefits me through this relationship? And also, what are my alternatives? If I don't have this relationship meeting these needs and these benefits in this relationship, do I have any alternatives to go to? What are those alternatives? Now, the problem with exchange theory is that it assumes that everyone's rational and actually thinks about cost-reward ratios and actually thinks about their level of alternatives that they have. And the fact is that people don't always do that. They're not always that rational. People can be very irrational in the way that they relate to other people or the reasons they maintain relationships. And if you think about it, a lot of dysfunctional relationships are very irrational because they have way too many costs, not very many rewards, and their alternatives would look a whole lot better than the dysfunctional relationship that they're in, but they're not thinking about it rationally. So this may not be a very good theory to explain all relationships because of the rationality assumption.